The hidden or ignored culture is the other one. What's that?
That is, like Chinese, they are not aware of some kind of culture, but when a foreigner brings it up, then you realize, wow, that's all.
Exactly. So the hidden or ignored culture is when it's something that is a cultural behavior or culturally influenced thing, but you're not aware of it until you see somebody from outside that culture not do that or do it incorrectly. Many years ago, we did an experiment where we brought in pairs of speakers. So we brought in pairs of American speakers and pairs of Chinese speakers, and we gave them similar tasks to do. Okay. So in this situation, the task was this for both the Americans and the Chinese. Was say you're living at home with your parents, you're with your parents, and you have a friend who's visiting you from outside the city, and your parents are little about the comings and goings of your friend. They're not mad or anything, but they're uneasy. So this is how would you talk? How would you negotiate this with your friend? How would you talk to your friend about this, about his or her presence in your home? So now when you do something like this, like if we had maybe 20 couples, 20 pairs, and most of it it's just but sometimes you get really clear things, a real clear conversation, real clear strategy. And here's what we got two here that we think are fairly clear. Now, one of the things that people sometimes talk about between Chinese and Americans, for example, is directness, the concept of directness. Okay. Who is direct?
The American.
The American. Who's indirect?
And the Chinese.
Chinese. Okay, and almost every time we do this, people point out that the Chinese is indirect, the Americans are direct. But what is the first sentence up there?
Not in this conversation.
The first sentence there is the point.
Yeah.
All right, and the American, the first conversation is. Do you have how long you'll be staying? Just curious. Okay, so the American doesn't get to the point at the very beginning. So this idea of directness may be something that needs to be a little bit refined. For example, there are certain areas where Chinese are very direct with people, and there are certain areas where Americans are very indirect. Okay, so like we're talking about health, anything that deals with health, or like somebody observes something about your physical being, the Chinese are much more likely to be direct about it than Americans. In fact, this is just the opposite, right? So one good example I have, all my years, whenever I get really tired and I get exhausted, I get what we call cold sore, shaman. I get that. And my point is, all the years that I can remember for decades, I have yet to have an American tell me, you have a cold sore. But every time I meet a Chinese friend, I have a cold sore. It's always, shaman. So that's an area, okay, that's direct versus indirect, right? But it's not like direct is a strategy and indirect is a strategy. What's the strategy here? What's the information in the culture that's at work here? Why do Americans avoid pointing out something like cold sore?
Because it's too obvious to point out.
Well, it's obvious, yeah, but what? But obvious isn't. That's not.
I think because when you have cold sore, it doesn't look good, and then if the other person points it out, they'll make you feel a bit embarrassed.
They make you feel.
This is not what you want the other people to find
Yeah, okay, sort of, it attacks your self-image, your self-confidence. So Americans avoid doing that. American will not, if somebody's got a cold, and no American, they might say, so if it's really, oh, that's a vicious cold you got, something like that. But very rarely do you point out something. If you've got a pimple, the only people, like you're in high school and you've got this big pimple, and the only people who point it out are people who are your enemies. Your friends never point it out. Right? So that sort of thing. Okay, so that's the American. The Americans, let's say they have a strategy of avoiding anything that's obvious and embarrassing or distracts a person. So even no matter what happens, the Americans will avoid it. That's a strategy, right? What's the Chinese strategy?
I think the Chinese strategy is to show the concern of the other person. They want to make the relationship closer.
Right. So that's the thing about in Chinese is you express concern. So as it's been explained to me many times, if you 超火 and nobody mentions it, that means they don't care about you. Right? So this is one of those places where you're either doing Chinese or you're doing American English. You can't do both. It's 180 degrees opposed to each other. You're either playing the Chinese game or you're playing the English, American English. But anyway, so that's good. Well, so the point I want to make here, and here's the big point, right? Here's the big point. The conversation that occurs in a culture, in a language, can be just a common, everyday kind of conversation. Nobody paid any attention. Everybody recognized what's the point. If you switch the cultural interpretation, so if you have an American cultural interpretation of a Chinese conversation, your chances are pretty high of getting negative interpretations. And you reverse it, same thing. If you have an American conversation, but you're interpreting it from the Chinese perspective, then you're going to have to assume you're going to have a lot of negative interpretations. So one of the things that are what we're trying to get up to and get to the point is, how do we handle this kind of thing? How do we train our students to not only recognize the situation, recognize what's going on, but also perform in that situation? So we don't want, if we're training Chinese to communicate with Americans, we don't want the Chinese to think that I have to be an obnoxious person in order to communicate with the Chinese. If we have an American learning to communicate with the Chinese, we don't have to say, okay, I have to be totally without principle, totally without any kind of honesty. If I get rid of all of that, I can communicate with the Chinese. That's not what we want. We want people to say this. We want to recognize this is a situation. This is a culturally approved kind of behavior. You can recognize this behavior. You can see what kind of behavior is appropriate in that category, and you can learn to do it. And you're not giving up anything. You're not giving up your Chinese modesty. You're not giving up your American honesty. All these virtues that we have in our own cultures, you don't have to give them up. You just have to be able to recognize how that works out in the other culture.